Chapter 2 The Risen Moon. I won't need answers, he had said. Xiao Xingjin still felt unsteady on his feet as he ached to reach out and steady himself against Zijin's solid presence next to him, just touch him, confirm yet again that this was neither dream nor nightmare. But Zijin hadn't appreciated being touched unnecessarily even before, and that had been many long, lonely years ago. He put the thought away, with all the other regrets, trying to ground himself in the present. He could hear labored breathing nearby, bubbling and torn, dying breaths that shouldn't hurt as much as the ache to reach out for Zijin did, but somehow it made his insides twist all the same. Xiao Xingjin, Xu Yang said again, still with that voice that was so strangely soft, warm and happy, Cheng Mei's voice, and for a moment the warring images in his head were almost too much, and he had to struggle to stay upright, a hollow jolt like from falling. Xu Yang, he replied, forcing his voice cold, forcing himself to remember a youthful but twisted face, a dark figure lazily sprawling above the mutilated dead bodies of the Chang clan, proudly eyeing his handiwork. He hadn't hated him then, only felt justly appalled. He should hate him now. You lied to me. All that time you lied. He had meant to sound condemning, not hurt. That didn't go very well. I didn't, not much. I simply omitted parts of the truth. Xu Yang, Cheng Mei, sounded eager to explain, even though every few words required desperate gasping for air. Xiao Xingjin took a short step forward, fists unconsciously clenching. Omitted parts of the truth? You deceived me in every way possible. You lied about everything that mattered, took advantage of my every kindness. We were enemies. Were? Xu Yang asked, and it could have been mocking if it hadn't sounded so hungry. He couldn't help but flinch, genuinely not knowing how to answer. But you said it yourself, Dao Zhang. Cheng Mei, Xu Yang wheezed. That first night, do you remember? Do you remember when we first came here, right here, to this courtyard, all those years ago? You said you just wanted to help me. You told me you didn't need my name. You told me it didn't matter. He had only heard that tone of voice once before, just before the world went dark and quiet. You believed me when I was lying, but now that I am telling the truth you won't? You should have stayed on your mountain. And his chest constricted. Where's Ajing? He said quietly, abruptly changing the topic, ashamed at himself that he hadn't thought to ask sooner. Xu Yang went quiet, conveniently too out of air to answer. I'm so sorry to have to tell you, Xiao Xingjin Shishu, Wei Wuxian said quietly behind him, but she's dead. He had half expected it, but the grief still knocked the air out of his lungs, and this time he did have to reach out and grab Zijin's shoulders for support, light-headed enough to almost collapse. You? He said quietly, turning back to Xu Yang's direction. You killed her? There was a battle, the man muttered, sounding sullen. She shouldn't have gotten involved. You blinded her and cut her tongue out, Wei Wuxian interceded, unable to keep quiet, sounding furious. Poisoned her into a half-corpse, and then you ran her through and left her to die. You did what? Breathed Xiao Xingjin, and again the unfamiliar weight of mortal flesh felt as though it sent him crashing to his knees. He was so dizzy it was hard to shape conscious thought. I let her live, Xu Yang hissed, defensively, because you would have wanted her to. Even though she destroyed everything, I only killed her when she left me no choice. Xiao Xingjin felt a breathless laugh escape him, grateful for Zijin's steady hand on his elbow. His hollowed eyes ached, and he could feel bloodied teeth soaking through the strip of cloth, starting to trickle down his cheeks. You really are a monster, he whispered. You always were. How could I be so blind that I didn't see it? There was a long silence, only punctured by Xu Yang's rapid, shallow breathing. This was not at all how this was supposed to go, he finally said, almost conversationally, sounding slightly perturbed. Xiao Xingjin was taken aback, and then something else started to rise in him, giving him back some strength, unfamiliar, itching, white-hot rage. How was it supposed to go, Xu Yang? He asked, and not having to force his voice into hardness anymore. I remember resisting you in that dark. Was I to become another of your puppets, obediently pulled along on your strings? Is that what you were trying to do? Is that what you wanted? Xu Yang said nothing, only drawing feeble breath after feeble breath. Answer me, he yelled, taking another half step forward. You owe me that much at least. He hadn't really expected a reply and was surprised when it came anyway. Yes, but no, I don't know. There was a note of seemingly genuine uncertainty there, and he found himself frozen, would have stared if he still had his sight. But if he had still had his sight, none of this would have happened in the first place, the most moot of points. You should really sit down and rest, Dao Zhang, Xu Yang slurred, voice soft again. You don't look well. Warm concern, and that was all Ching Mei, was laughter and teasing and familiarity and home. He wanted to weep, not just silent, sticky tears, but something deep and cleansing that might wash away all the pain, but somehow it just stuck in his throat and wouldn't come out. I still want more answers, he found himself whispering, even as the world started spinning again. At first he thought it was the deafening rush in his head drowning out all other sounds, but he was slowly realizing he couldn't hear any more strangled breaths. He's losing consciousness, he had heard someone say, and wasn't sure if they were talking about Xu Yang or himself. No, not at all, Xu Yang breathed on his last exhale, light-headed laughter on his voice, a sound of sheer delight. How could I possibly sleep when the risen moon shines so bright? Wei Wuxian and Lao Wenji had left some time ago. He had slowly come to, confused, not realizing at first that he must have passed out, but in his half-slumber he had heard their subdued voices speaking to Zizhen. Once they realized he was awake, they had all hurried to his side to ask if he needed assistance, caring and concerned, and he had felt rather embarrassed. He wasn't used to needing help or worrying others. The young cultivators had told them what little they had recently learned of puppets and poison and the vicious truth of empathy. The details of Ah Ching's fate made his eyes throb and bleed like never before. She had seen the truth all along when he couldn't, and had tried to keep them both safe. How many times hadn't she warned him during those 3 years? As many times as he had smiled and waved her concerns aside. And now she was dead. We have to go, Wei Wuxian had finally said, gently. The kids are waiting for us outside, and you just know they'll stumble into a ditch and break all their bones if they decide to come back and look for us once it's getting dark. And we have to tell Zojun about what we found here, what we found out. We have to see if what we heard was the truth. He had nodded tiredly, noticing the slip, but appreciating not having to hear that name, think about that man again quite so soon. He is stable for now, Lao Wenji had said stiffly, and so much for that. He should live if you so choose, so that you can ask your questions. He had forced himself to bow, grateful and ashamed at once, because everyone else had a sense to want the demon dead, and that they deferred to his wishes was both a relief and a burden. Thank you, Han Guanjun. Just, you can't trust him, Wei Wuxian had said. I know, he had replied, and winced at how bitter it came out. I know that now. Shishu, sometimes it's better to just let things go, poking around too much in old hurt. A pause, as though Wei Wuxian shook his head, and he tried to remember his Shiji's face enough to fill in a likely expression. Only makes for new hurt. Take it from me. Old sad lifetimes are best left alone. His voice was light at the end, as though he had told a joke, but there was something heartfelt there, and he had nodded and managed a small smile. "Thank you." And then they had left. Shi Yang had remained blissfully comatose all the while, very firmly bound to one of those poles of the thatched awning with enough ropes and knots to subdue a tiger, or so Xiao Xingjin had been told. He hadn't been able to bring himself to go close enough to look with his own hands. The small fire crackled, offering welcome warmth. His heavy limbs still felt deathly cold, and he tried not thinking too hard about the reason why. Zijin was beside him, hadn't left him but for the shortest of moments, and that warmed him almost as much as the fire. He had sat down close, elbow against elbow, and didn't seem to mind the touch, almost as though he too hungered for a closeness long gone. Xiao Xingjin tried not to read too much into it, but savored it nonetheless. "Zijin," he had said, more for the simple joy of tasting that name again than to get his attention, but he felt the man move beside him, likely turning to give him a questioning look. It felt natural to have him there. Right. His day had been a confusing flicker of nightmares so far, but this simple joy, it was good. "It's good to see you again," he said quietly. There was only silence, of course. Zijin could be taciturn at the best of times, but now that any choice had been taken from him, the silence felt deeply wrong, and his heart twisted. He felt a touch at his elbow again, and then a hand taking his slowly, as though asking permission. At first he thought his companion only wanted to show his reassurance, but then he felt his hand turned palm up in Zijin's and a finger tracing a pattern against his skin. "Oh, wait, I wasn't paying attention. Say it again?" "Good to see you too." His eyes stung again, but this time with something more than hurt, something that felt like grief and happiness all tangled up into one. "I'm sorry," he wanted to say, "for killing you, for Baishu, for parting ways, for not being able to give you the closure you deserve just yet." But those were words too loud and sharp, and it felt too soon to speak them. "It's cold," he said instead. "We should go inside and see if we can find some blankets." Zijin hesitated, then traced more words into his hand. It was hard to make out the more complex characters, and they had to start over twice, take it slow, his mind and memories fleshing out the simple signs into Zijin's distinctive pattern of speech. "Don't expect too much. It's been a long time." The house felt all wrong the moment he stepped inside, as cold and dusty as the outside. It smelled musty and abandoned. He fought the instinctive urge to turn around in the doorway and determinedly pressed on. His feet knew every familiar path of these rooms. It was home, but the wrongness of the details kept bombarding his senses. No scent of drying herbs or sword polish, no warmth, no sound of Ah-Ching, Ah-Ching, and Cheng Mei trading snappy barbs nearby. He started violently out of sleepwalking the memories when Zijin grabbed his upper arm out of nowhere and held him back. It took him several moments of confusion before remembering to raise his hand to ask for an explanation. "Careful, the roof caved in." He gingerly inched forward with his foot and encountered a pile of debris on the floor. They had finished fixing the last parts of this roof only last winter, and he remembered modest pride at having learned to do his share of it well. It had been sturdy, made to last, like everything they had built. And just like the rest, it had come crashing down. Zijin, how long has it been?" He barely recognized his own voice. Even with his hand raised, it was a long while before he got a reply. The signs traced slowly. "I don't know. Long. My memories." The sentence wasn't finished, and he didn't push for it to be. The last he had sensed of Zijin before the dark was something not him, a half-dead thing, another puppet, only recognizable because of Fushu in his hand. Of course, he wouldn't have any answers either. If he couldn't remember much from that time, it was probably a blessing. "Daojang?" The muffled voice from outside slashed across his mind like a red-hot blade, and he shuddered. He ignored it, clenching his jaw and carefully navigating around the pile of wood and thatched straw. He had come in here for blankets, and he would damn well finish at least one thing he had started today. Daojang, Xiaoxingjin. With proper meditative mind-grounding techniques, it was almost possible to tune out the increasingly frenzied calls, and he could tell Zijin was trying hard to do the same at his side, tense and angry. When he finally reached the bed, the blankets on it were little more than a pile of cobwebs and mold under his hands. He stood still for a moment, then turned on his heel to leave. There really was nothing here for him anymore. Daojang, you really shouldn't leave like that without saying anything. It's rude. Of course, there would be a thrill of relief and gentle chiding to Cheng Mei's voice, sugary deceit as natural to him as breathing. He was in no mood to be lectured by him at the moment. How long? He asked shortly, walking all the way up to the bound man. Anger made it easier to face him, far easier than the hurt. How long has it been? There was a moment of silence. Some 7 years, maybe a bit more. Who can bother to keep count? That was a lot of years, he absently thought, surprised at not feeling stunned, which probably meant he was. He couldn't say if he had expected more or less. It felt like no time had passed at all, but he still had a sense deep in his bones that the world had turned and moved and wasn't the same as the one he last remembered. And so far he had ever really understood the world at all. Listen, Daojang, Shi Yang said, and the sticky mirth was gone, replaced by something serious. You really shouldn't rush around like that yet. The spellwork that bound your soul back in your body is very complex. It's delicate. You need to let it settle. If you try too much too soon, you'll get hurt. What would it matter to you? He snapped back, bitterly, rhetorically, because he realized he wasn't ready for any genuine answer just yet. Thankfully, only a long silence answered him, and despite his best efforts, he still couldn't keep himself from wondering what expressions passed across Cheng Mei's face, now that he knew what it looked like. Another wave of brief vertigo passed through him, and he took half a step back, then abruptly turned to sit down by the fire, refusing to feel rude about it. Soul settling back into bones. That would explain the horrible sensation of falling. Will it pass? He asked shortly. There was another long silence, enough to make him both angry and unnerved about what answer might be forthcoming. Zijin settled quietly beside him, protectively inserting himself between him and Xu Yang again, and he gave him a minute, grateful nod. I don't know. Xu Yang seemed to have settled for answering back as frankly as he had asked his questions. This hadn't been done before, not like this, hopefully. He gave a hollow laugh at that, then bit his lip. Still able to make me laugh after all that. Hopefully. That's why you need rest, Xu Yang repeated, sounding frustrated now. Stop fretting and pacing and overthinking. You can be angry and upset with me all you like later. He didn't know how to answer that, but suddenly Xu Yang burst into laughter, and that was the wicked evil laugh he remembered from just before Shuanghua's burning bite at his throat. Well, I'm still here, aren't I? You could have just let me bleed out. You didn't, so yes, I'm guessing there will be a later, and that it's not your choice to make. He realized Zijin must have signed something he hadn't seen, and for the first time in a very long time he felt truly lost in his blindness, deaf as well as sightless. I'm tired, he said. He felt Zijin immediately turn back to him, a hand on his arm. Then rest, Daojang, Cheng Mei told him softly, as though the demonic laugh had come from another throat entirely. Rest, he felt Zijin sign against his skin, though the rush in his head made it hard to make out the signs again. I will stay with you while you sleep. And this time, when he fell, he kept falling, 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 into darkness.
Blooper.
And we have to tell Sojun. Rhetorically. Shu, Shua, Shuangwa.